it's awesome that everybody is here. And I spoke with Peg a little bit before through email, and I think it'd be a great idea to introduce ourselves. I'll start with myself. So I'm Bernadette Montana. I have a metaphysical shop called Breed's Closet, and we've been around for about 20 years. It's really exciting about that. And my background is actually from two lineages, if you want to call it that. One coming from the Rochester, Binghamton area. So I have studies from that area. And then also with Janet Farah and Gavin Bone. So I'm a third degree under them. So I have that sort of training behind me. I know that that's not all that common anymore, but it just gives you a little bit of background as to who I am. And I have a coven called the Star and Crescent Moon. And gee, there's so much. Mom of three, progressive witch, under, like I said, under Janet and Gavin. So I consider myself New Yorker at heart, transplanted to Cornwall. Came up here. I'm only about an hour out of the city, but I came up in 92, and then been doing this good work for as far as I can think of, because I'm an old punk that started with enchantments and Lady Rhea way back when, and yeah, you know what I mean, and been doing it ever since. And so that's a bit about my background.
I guess I'm next. I'm Valerie.
Yeah.
Mich'El Oliver, and I am the originator of the Thorn Trees TV series idea, and I'm also the co-creator of it, and I'm also a producer for the series. And let's see, you're talking about your background a bit, and I'm not quite sure really where I fit, because I'm sort of an amalgamation, I guess, of a lot of different kind of spiritual influences, which I would say Christian, I would say Native American, I would say, it's interesting, I would probably say pagan as well, although yeah. I don't identify myself as a witch, and I always go to the traditional, like my understanding of the traditional definition of a witch. And to me, I know that things change, but I always think of, oh, you know, you're in a coven and you go through all of this training and, you know, things like that. But I'm definitely earth-based, universe-based, connected. And I was talking to Bernadette earlier about my Native American background and having animal totems and things like that. I remember the day that I discovered, I'm gonna call it the heartbeat of the universe, so to speak. I was in the woods and I was just like leaning against a tree, and something just said to hug the tree. And it freaked me out a little bit, because I will swear up and down that I felt a heartbeat from that tree. And that sort of changed my whole perspective about nature and connection and things like that. So let's see, my background briefly has been as an editor and as an art director, mainly for nonprofits, and doing a lot of freelancing, having my own business. And storytelling's always been a part of my life. Mainly in terms of short stories and poetry. And I think what happened was I know what happened. I had a near-death experience on a trip to Cusco, Peru. And I was there working with working on a book for a master healer. And they told me my life was going to change after having this near-death experience. And it took some time, but it did. And I've just been really attracted to, and I wonder, because, you know, I think I do believe in past life experiences, and I feel that it's possible that I was a witch in a past life, because I have this affinity, you know, for witches and witchcraft. But yet, on the other hand, I was raised Christian, and I'm very connected to that as well, which is why I was really excited when doing research for one of our publications called Rachel's Gazette that's dedicated to stories about witches, and to attract people to our Thorn Trees TV series. I think I just lost my thought. So I was talking about Rachel's Gazette and so forth. Oh yeah, like my connection to witches and witchcraft. I just got totally sick of hearing people equate the word witch with bitch. We'll just say it. And all of the negativity about witches. And it just really offended me. And certainly there's other things that I could be offended about and sometimes am, as a woman of color, as a Black person, as a female, as a non-binary person. But that just really got on my nerves. And
Yep.
and then things evolved in terms of this project. But we can talk more about the portrayal of witches, and we will, and Thorn Trees, and how and why Thorn Trees came about. So I'm gonna say thank you and pass to you, Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Kaufman. I'm an assistant producer intern for Thorn Trees. I'm a senior at Brandeis University, and I'm studying psychology, creative writing, and film.
I could bounce off of Rachel here a bit and say my background is I went to SUNY Purchase for set design. So I'm actually a production designer, art director, and scenic charge for film in my like real life career. And I'm also a witch as well. I'm actually a 3rd degree high priestess under Bernadette. So I have the same lineage. And then I've hived off and have my own. I have my own group and my own tradition. My own little kind of community thing that I'm working with too, and combining with Bernadette's mom. And I'm teaching classes as well, publicly and privately. I've been teaching for about 15 years now. And yeah, it's spiritual tour guide. If you went on Instagram or Facebook is where you'd find that. I'm actually launching a course this week, which is going to be cool. But so my life and my passions have combined as well. So in finding my passion in film and art departments, and always having my passion in magic, my art and magic have combined. I've been on sets as a scenic charge where people have asked me for help with props and they happen to be tarot cards. I'm like, oh, do you know I teach this? And I'll do classes for the director, producer, and props department, and actors and actresses, or that's come up kind of a few times now. And now I'm also a historical magic consultant for film. If you go on my IMDb page, that's a thing now. Who knew? So my passions have combined as well in that journey. And I've had the fortunate opportunity to start at a young age, both with my intuitive, similar to you, Valerie. I've had my intuitive like teachings were from, I used to say the woods taught me, the forest taught me. And I've had experiences like that that really changed my life. I was fortunate to have my biological mom is also very spiritual, and she took me to some instances. And that's actually how I ended up finding Bernadette. And through that, through the Star and Crescent Coven, I was an elder with them, and I had the fortunate opportunity to learn from our elders at a young age. I consider myself a witch as well, but I specialize in universal magic because I've been fortunate to study under so many different traditions and paths. And I work a lot with both Terran and Astral, and the idea of the tree. Your roots, your branches can only extend to the astral as wide as your roots are, otherwise you fall over in your next storm, right? So you have to know your past and your history in order to understand your future and how you move forward and grow. You don't want to get root rot in that pot. You can't just grow this way. You got to grow both ways and be nourished and breathe with the forest and with the universe. And how important is it that, you know, every breath we take is contributing to life in the world as well, because trees and plants need us just as much as we need them just to even breathe. And I love that idea, that symbiotic relationship that we have with the world. And even when we're feeling our most down and out, like this year, most people feel they're feeling that self-worth issue we had as our kids, like in our childhood, right? But just breathing contributes to life, and that's magic. And people forget that. And when Bernadette started with this project, I was honored that she started to include me in it, not only as a witch, but as a film person, and combining our passions. And this is just a beautiful way to learn from our past to nourish our future.
I'm Peg Aloi. I'm a freelance writer, film critic, and academic, a professional gardener.
Yes.
And people are sharing their sort of origin stories. I was raised Catholic in a family full of people that hunted and fished and gardened and foraged for food. So when I left Catholicism behind, it was like And I was very interested since a very young age in portrayals of witches in movies. Had probably a formative experience watching Crowhaven Farm on TV in like 1970, which tells you I'm fairly old. I'm sorry, that's my dog who's going to continue to whine in the background. Hold on, Maisie, quiet. Sorry. So I learned, I think sometime probably in college, that there were actual witches, and I thought, oh, they're all in England. I will never see them. And then I met some pagans in graduate school, got sort of involved with them, eventually found my way to an Alexandrian coven in Boston that was founded in the 1960s and still actually has some original members kicking around. Go lay down with your bone. Yes, we're very proud of you. Good girl. Maisie. Oh, sorry. So I was one of the 3 co-founders, the co-founders really were Ren Walker and Fritz Jung of The Witch's Voice in Boston in 1996, which became probably one of the biggest pagan websites of all time. It actually was sort of shut down and sort of ended and archived last year after 23 years. Once social media came along, the networking was starting to take care of itself, but it was a major source of networking news, won a lot of web awards, whatever, it had millions of members all around the planet. It was an incredible amount of work that Fritz and Ren did. I was sort of the person that helped along, and I also did a lot of media reviews and interviews and that kind of thing. I had a blog for a number of years called The Witching Hour on various platforms. Right now it's just on its own page. It has lain fallow for a few months, so don't be all excited that I write in it all the time. But I do a year-end thing every year, and there will be one for 2020, because every year it seems there's a lot more wonderful witchy media properties that come along. Some are so bad they're good, and some are really great. This year I was interviewed in a documentary for French television about Hollywood witches, which was really fascinating. And we had some people like Pam Grossman and Kirsten Soleil, Bianca London. I can't remember the other women, but that was a great experience. That premiered at the Salem Horror Fest. And I'm hoping that filmmaker is going to be able to do a longer project, because it really was not long enough, just kind of glossed over the basics, but it was a great project. I have co-organized with my best friend and writing partner, Hannah Sanders, Sis Fiona, 2 conferences at Harvard University on witchcraft and paganism and folklore and media. That was a few years ago, where we've worked on, we co-authored or co-edited an anthology of essays on teenage witchcraft. In my work as a film and media studies scholar, I've presented a lot of papers at various conferences, including throughout the UK, on various aspects of paganism and everything from travel writing to poetry to film and video. Hope to be doing another conference on that at some point. Currently, book projects are a book on witchcraft and media called The Witching Hour, hopefully coming out in 2021. Also co-editing an anthology of women in folk horror, because there's just not enough women writing about folk horror, or at least not enough women whose voices are emphasized in that genre. What else? I've also done a little advising for the movies, unofficially and uncredited for the most part, like the Blair Witch Project sequel, Blair Witch 2, I was an advisor on that. There was this period of time, and I'm going to leave it at this, that was really interesting, and I'm going to say it was probably around the year 2000, 2001, 2002, for about 2 or 3 years, where I was getting constant email from television producers who wanted to do reality TV shows about real witches.
I remember that. I got called for something too around that.
Yeah, me too.
And so I got interviewed, and I got wined and dined, and I got, asked for contacts and like all this stuff. None of them ever came to anything, weirdly enough, but I thought that was interesting. But what I discovered in that was, at the time, here comes my other cat, believe it or not. This is Nigel.
Hi, Nigel.
Also an adopted name. Okay, so the thing that happened at that point was that the producers of these TV shows, perhaps as a result of what was popular on TV at the time, like American Horror Story, some other things, they only wanted witches who either lived in Salem, could not live anywhere else, or were between the ages of, say, 18 and 30.
Yeah.
And there were no other witches apparently that lived anywhere else or were any older, you know, who were interesting for television purposes. And that was really interesting to me because in my experience at that point, you know, witchcraft, modern witchcraft, contemporary paganism had been around for quite some time. And there are all kinds of interesting people doing all kinds of interesting things in all kinds of places, big cities, small towns, wherever.
Mhm.
And the idea that television's portrayal of real witches was in fact a very, very arbitrary sort of slice of what
Yeah.
was out there. And I think that we also see that portrayed in sort of fictional narrative portrayals of contemporary witchcraft. And we'll be talking more about that later. But anyway, I'm going to pass it along because now I'm babbling because I have a cat purring on me.
Hi, my name is Molly Shilling. I'm a senior at Penn State studying telecommunication with another major in English as well. And like Rachel, I am an assistant producer intern.
Hello, good evening. My name's Jacob Larch. I'm the co-creator and screenwriter of Thorn Trees. I've been working on this with Val from the very beginning. Val first reached out to me to work on the original concept and the story. And then from the back and forth and the ideas bouncing around, we came up with a cast, a story, and Val pretty much very graciously gave me carte blanche to create pretty much everything, which everything I then ran by her to make sure that it was completely fully going ahead in full agreement. Who am I? Right, well, obviously, as you can gather, I'm English. I come from Liverpool in the northwest of England, famous for the Beatles and many other things, good football team. Not that I follow football. Father of two girls, one is in Oxford doing modern languages, one, the youngest is just turned 16 and wants to go into the military as a doctor in a couple of years' time. And in January, my wife and I passed 25 years of marriage. She's my only love.
Congratulations.
Thank you. She's my first and my only love. And I draw a lot of strength from that. Professionally, I work in victim support with victims of child abuse, domestic violence and rape. And I did that frontline for about 11.5 years. Now I manage a team of staff and support people who do that job. But I was often called upon to deal with a lot of more difficult cases and take a lot of strength from that. So I've very much intuitive with victims of crime, especially female and young victims of crime, something which I tended to be asked to do a lot of because I make people laugh. I'm very good at getting people on side and helping people to get through their trauma and get through their ordeal and move forward in a positive way. So that's something which I've definitely brought into the writing. Screenwriting, I've been writing, gosh, it seems like I can't remember when I started, a long time. I'm one of these many writers out there who has been told how wonderful and talented and gifted they are, but has never actually had anything commissioned. I have been very close so many times. Feedback is continuously up the standard of television in Britain and America, the standard of movies in Britain and America, but a no is a no is a no. So this is at the moment a hobby and it's something I enjoy a great deal. Currently have Thorn Trees, and I have actually one of the projects currently going through the circuit for commission and submission. Family origins, Norse originally, but my great-grandmother was also Castilian Spanish with a very heavy Moorish bloodline. So I do have links back to North Africa and but primarily to Scandinavia and Denmark. Baptized a Catholic, became pagan, or sort of ran them together, as many people do in my late teens to early 20s, when you begin to realize that in this country, when the Catholic Church moved in, they basically stole all the pagan rituals and all the worship sites, built churches on them. They took all the traditions and changed them to their own. They changed various names and made them their own. And when people who are, it kind of amuses me when I come across people who are staunchly Catholic who say paganism is evil. And you start going through traditions and say, okay, so what you do here? And then you point out how it was actually originally a pagan tradition. I had this conversation recently when someone I know said, Christmas is a Christian tradition. I said, okay, well, let's look at this. celebrated in Yule, midwinter, where the Norse culture would break out the food supplies to celebrate the passing of the longest night. Therefore, there were less dark nights ahead of them than there are behind them, and they'd survived thus far. Children who were good. The head of the Norse pantheon, Odin, would send his ravens, Hugin and Munin, into your rafters to listen to the children to see who was well behaved and who was not. The children were encouraged to put their stockings out, and Odin would ride around on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, and he would then put presents in the stockings of the good children. Well, the Christian church in Scandinavia didn't like the idea of an 8-legged horse who became 8 reindeer. Odin, they didn't like the idea of, and he became linked to St. Nicholas, as was the Christians claim they invented it. They didn't, they took it from the Vikings. What do we have at Christmas? A Yule log. Vikings used to burn, Norse used to burn a actual log. It was a Yule log. They cut some of it aside and left it for kindling for the year after. They would decorate their tree with lights and with ribbons. The list goes on. So, yes, Norse pagan, kind of in the Skald storytelling tradition, fits with being a writer. Love of history, love of mythology. I came into Thorn Trees to write as realistic a story as possible, because when you look at the history, and I know we're getting onto this in this podcast, when you get onto the way that witches and magic is portrayed in film and television, it is usually woefully dire, inaccurate, and convinced that all witches are, to just quote Peg, 18 to 30 years of age, young, blonde, gorgeous, running around naked in the woods with flowers in their hair, and that's exactly what they want to see. Not that actually witchcraft and paganism and Wicca and all of its derivations are broad, wide, diverse as you can imagine. And you get a bit sick of seeing this. I mean, I was a big fan of Sabrina the Teenage Witch growing up with Melissa Joan Hart, and then Netflix does the more recent version, and saw the first 2 episodes and thought, yeah. So I've come to this with a view to write this.
I love that new one. I love it so much.
No, go ahead, love the new one. I'm just not a fan. I have a lot of links with magic and witchcraft anyway. My spiritual brother is his partner is a druid in Anglesey, and his partner Chris said a while ago that in all of his research, all of his studies, he said essentially back in the very, 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 very long time ago, the whole pagan world looked to the Emerald Isle of the United Kingdom, before it was called that, as their Mecca, as their Jerusalem, as their head of their pantheon. And in England, they all looked to Anglesey. So the Ferich, the original Anglesey senior order of druids, who were wiped out by the Romans. In fact, the Romans were busy wiping them out when Boudica staged her rebellion with the Iceni down at Colchester. They were the original head of, if you could have a head of the actual pagan movement at the time. Around that time period, they were the actual heads of it. So I got some of my advice, some of my background from Anglesey. The rest of it I read. I'm a voracious historical reader. I'm very good at reading multiple texts, multiple books, and getting different viewpoints. And then from there, you can usually always draw a common thread and a common analysis from the writing to then bring it into your own writing and look at things and say, actually, is that really right? Or how are we going to do this? Hence why one of the main themes in Thorn Trees is, for me, Thorn Trees is not a show about witches. Thorn Trees is a show about family who just happen to be witches. And I think that's a very pronounced difference.
Yes.
And I know we've had questions about where's the CGI, where's magic. I mean, I think this may come out later. But yeah, for me, part of the strength in the story that we're telling and that we're writing and we're creating is in its realistic depiction. And that begins with, these are people. These are people that you know. They could be your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, your neighbor, your friend, your, a college student. They could be anything, your work colleague. So that's where I come to it, and that's probably enough for me.
I love how everybody's take on this and how they came into this was, you know what I mean? Like you heard with how Deidra came into it. I came into all of this because of my punk days and stumbling on enchantments one day with Lady Rhea. But I was studying Native American stuff. I carry a pipe. Actually, I carry a Lakota pipe on all of that. And it just evolved from there, and family traditions and stuff. but it's family first. You know, like I came into this, my family is Italian and Puerto Rican and all of this other mix and all of the stuff that we were raised with, I started to do the research into. And it kind of evolved. And when you say that Thorn Trees is about family, well, that's right. We all were raised with these types of backgrounds and help us and mold us into who we are today, you know? And that's kind of how I look at it. And so when I look at Thorn Trees, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. I think for me, Magick in its portrayal, and I know we'll kind of come on to this, in terms of how Magick has been portrayed, one of the things which has always stuck with me is the concept of what a witch is, and that most images of witchcraft have been created by centuries of church fear-mongering and demagoguery. Fear what you don't understand. And if you don't fear them, then you can fear what the church will do to you if you side with them, if you practice it. And hence why one of the storytelling elements you've always had in witchcraft is of the Jedi type mentality. The student goes to the master. The young girl goes to the older woman. Not, as you say, it's family. It's within family, but that may be too awkward for some people to grasp, and for previous incarnations of sort of stories to actually deal with, or for their audiences to understand that these are normal people. You have to set them aside. So we'll have the witch, somebody who lives in the woods, and we'll have the main character who becomes a witch, somebody who goes to them to learn. Okay, yeah. Doesn't it begin at the hearth? Doesn't it begin at your mother's knee?
Well, yes, of course.
You know what?
I'd like to speak to that, which is that we saw with modern witchcraft, with sort of the new. I'm sorry, my dog's chewing a bone. That's that noise. When we had some, when we saw the witchcraft that was brought over to the United States from England, sort of turn into something that melded with some other consciousness raising and the civil rights era, and whoa, that was my cat knocking something over. All kinds of things happening in the United States in terms of cultural upheaval in the 1960s and 70s. We then saw that the modern witchcraft movement, even though there were groups of people doing things, there were hippies and there were neo-pagans and there were women's groups, Dianic covens, there were gay witches, all these things. We also saw that as books started to be published that were purporting to expose the secrets of witchcraft and all of that, and then there were people talking about this is, how these things work. We started to see that there were not enough covens to take in people that wanted to be witches. So then, of course, we come up with this idea that you can be a solitary witch and you can initiate yourself. So this idea that witchcraft comes from a family-based legacy was still, of course, very attractive to people. So then we started to see this trend of, there were two things that happened. One was that pagan publishers like Llewellyn or whatever started publishing all these books about certain traditions that purported to be family-based. Things out of Ireland, things out of Scotland, things out of Italy, things out of Spain, other countries, Australia, wherever. But also you started to hear in the zeitgeist a lot of people saying, well, I was initiated by my grandmother. And most of the time, that was not true, because people were starved for this authenticity that did not exist. And part of the reason was that we were fed this idea via Gardner, who was responsible for the first sort of widespread model of modern witchcraft, which was Wicca. We were fed this idea that witchcraft was this ancient thing that people could be part of this lineage, when Gardner's version of witchcraft was something he made up practically out of whole cloth. So instead of taking credit for that and how cool and creative and artistic that was, he kept insisting that he found this old book of, traditional stuff. And so this idea that if you're not connected to a lineage or a tradition, to this day, we still call our witchcraft practices traditions, even if they're only 10 years old. This idea that you have to be part of this bigger, older thing in order to be a witch, and that you feel somehow inferior or often judged by other people if you're not part of that. This has been a really problematic, and I think you know, difficult thing for us to overcome in the modern witchcraft community. And I'm just going to put that out there.
Well, it's interesting because I'm thinking about, you know, you're talking about family and you're talking about tradition, and I was just thinking, well, what was my first exposure to witches and witchcraft? And that would be The Wizard of Oz. And what's interesting is that was a family of witches. Am I right? There was the good witch of the north, and then the wicked witch of the west.
So they were all sisters.
Yeah, they were all sisters, so they were family. But then, you know, it was like, you didn't really go in. I mean, the story was not about, you know, a family of witches. It was more about, well, we know what it was about. But they reduced it. What I came to understand, though, which I think might have been helpful, was that, oh, okay, so there's this family, and some of them are bad, and some of them are good. So it was very polarizing. There was no gray in between. You were either a good witch or a bad witch, and that kind of language was used in it. And then I think the second thing I saw, because you know, I'm going to be 65, I've been around for a while, I think was probably a very sexy, we were talking about this before, movie with this actress called Kim Novak, and it was called Bell, Book and Candle. And that had no family connection whatsoever. She was a solitary, I think, or was she? See, I don't remember. I have to go back and look at it.
Yeah.
But maybe she was in a coven. Maybe she knew other witches. I don't remember. And I guess that would be quote unquote family. But I started to see these movies where there were these beautiful, sexy women, and they were strong, and they had influence, and they had power. And I thought that was really cool. And they were, well, trying to attract a man or put a spell on a man to be with him. I'm not sure how crazy I was about that. But just going back to like my earliest impressions. But that was kind of a bad thing, as I recall, to not be married and to be a witch.
Shall we talk about that idea that the movies have generally portrayed witches as women and all the tropes and stereotypes that go along with that? Shall I do my 5-minute?
Oh, yes.
Do it.
Yes, Peg.
So I won't necessarily get this in order, but if we want to look at the portrayal of witches in the movies, if we look at the very first film that was made about a witch, we talked about this a little bit in our chat the other day. It was in 1922 out of Sweden. It was called Häxan, which means witchcraft. And it was a black and white film. It was a silent film that had some music to it, you know, music track added. And it was about this, it sort of explored all these sort of very witchy stereotypes that came out of the Middle Ages and the portrayals of witchcraft folklore. Some of them are from Scandinavia also. Or something just, oh, there's screen sharing. Oh, there it is. Great, thank you. I was gonna put together a little, you know, PowerPoint with pictures, but I didn't, so thanks for doing that. So the portrayal of this witch, she's very, very ugly. She's very, very evil. She does terrible things, and she is sort of vanquished in the end as a bad person. The next portrayal we see that becomes popularized is the Wizard of Oz that you were just talking about. In the Wizard of Oz, we also have a witch who's very ugly. She has bright green skin. The green skin, by the way, this became really popularized with the Wizard of Oz, but that comes from paintings by Goya, a Spanish painter. And so he has sort of 16th century, 17th century paintings of witches. Some of them had green skin. So that it sort of evolved a little bit out of that. But we have this witch who is extremely jealous of a young woman on the cusp of sexual maturity. And the symbol of that sexual maturity is these ruby red slippers. This is a sort of a euphemism for menstruation, for sexuality. We have this young nubile woman. She even has red hair, bright red lips. She has the blue gingham pinafore. This is all about color symbolism. The blue symbolizes kind of like the Virgin Mary. It symbolizes innocence and purity. And green in cinema, that shade of green tends to represent the outsider or some kind of alien presence. Sometimes in cinema, green represents nature. But we have this battle basically over the power contained in these ruby slippers, which represent feminine, youthful vitality, which is something that the older witch no longer has and desperately wants. And that's why Dorothy is gifted with this. And it's a sort of a battle between the two of them. So Bell Book and Candle came along in the 1950s, but I think we had some other, Hollywood-based witchy movies that came along that often would portray women as sort of evil. Bewitched, of course, came along in black and white. And then, I Married a Witch, really gorgeous film. Again, this idea of the witch as the femme fatale. So Hollywood, of course, is interested in things that are very, very dramatic and that establish a lot of conflict, but they're also interested in sexuality. Because sexuality, people really want to see beautiful, sexy people falling in love and doing things. So when the idea of the witch as this beautiful, seductive being who, she tempted men and she kind of would get what she wanted with magic and witchcraft, and she was incredibly beautiful. No man can resist her. I was in Fritz Lieber's Conjure Wife as well, this idea that you would be married to a woman who was a witch, and that marriage was sometimes the thing that took the witch's power away. So Samantha in Bewitched struggled with that. We saw that in Bell Book and Candle, this idea that if a woman marries a man, she loses her powers. And it's in I Married a Witch. And this idea that men, a witch on her own can keep her power, but as soon as a woman is, there's a sexual union with a man, that can sometimes take the power away. This is a trope we see repeated in a lot of different witchcraft stories. In the 1960s and 70s, when we have the dawn of the women's liberation movement and, women's rights, we start to see portrayals of women as witches that are highly sexualized, but in a way that's more positive. This idea that women can take control of their sexuality, and also they can be witches. And of course, we had the actual witchcraft movement happening in the United States at the time and in England. So we have a couple of things happening in the 60s and 70s. We have women as witches who are fully sexual autonomous beings, but also we have women who are in league with the devil, actually with Satan. So we kind of come full circle, and suddenly in the 60s and 70s, the witches are like medieval witches again. They're kissing the devil's behind. They want to kneel at the Dark Lord's, phallic altar. So all that the satanic witchcraft cinematic movement is really fascinating to me. There's a lot of terrible movies that came out of it, but also really interesting ones. And what's going on there is this, I think, a cultural struggle, and also because filmmaking was still very much a male-dominated art at that time. The portrayals of women as witches in the 60s and 70s, even if they were portrayed as contemporary women, they were still not allowed to be sexually autonomous. They still had to be controlled by the devil, or they were seduced by the devil, and that's why they were practicing witchcraft, or they were totally victimized, like Rosemary's Baby, where you have this woman who is an amazing film, a film that changed everything. And I just briefly need to say about Rosemary's Baby that Rosemary's Baby is single-handedly responsible for the rise of the satanic panic in the United States. And every testimonial from any person who claimed to be a victim of satanic ritual abuse or in a coven that impregnated women and then sacrificed the babies to the devil and buried them under the floorboards, to the point where these rumors were so widespread that the FBI established a task force to investigate it and found nothing. But every single one of those testimonials could be describing the scene in Rosemary's Baby, where Rosemary has a dream that she's being impregnated by the devil. There's naked old people, they're standing in a circle, they're chanting and singing, there's candles, it's just textbook. And it's kind of amazing that people didn't see through it. And this is why my friend Michael Coben, he's a kind of a film scholar over in England, he's used to call me one of the most original witchcraft scholars, whatever, because he said I was the first person to articulate that. I'm like, other people must have noticed this, but that Rosemary's Baby is kind of where that began. And people love that too, this idea that women are having to be on the guard against the devil stealing their very, the essence of their sexuality, which is the baby in the womb, So I I love all that shit. I don't, you know, this is always what people, I'm like a bad pagan spokesperson, and I'm like a bad pagan film critic because I love this stuff so much. It's delightful, it's rich, it's layered, it's amazing, it's entertaining.
That's the
And
thing.
yet, I certainly would love to see movies about modern witches in which there's no special effects. Because we don't actually have special effects in our lives. And I remember when Fritz and Ren were filmed for some documentaries on TV back in the, I guess in the 1990s, they would try to portray what it looked like when real witches were doing real magic. And they would have, you know, dry ice machines and purple lighting and glitter and all this stuff. And it was just kind of ridiculous. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it looked great. Everyone had all these cool costumes and all this stuff, but it was just kind of silly. Like, how do we make it look like magic is happening? You don't have to do that. It's happening. Just so anyway, so I got to try. So just a little bit more. So then I want to talk about the fact that, wait, I didn't even have some. My cat knocked over all my movies. That's what happened.
Uh-oh.
So the only one I have left to show you is The Love Witch, which is backwards now. But, and also has kind of a 1970s vibe. But it seems to me that everything that's happening with the portrayal of witches in movies has been about portraying the witch as a temptress,
Yes.
as a hag that nobody wants to have sex with anymore, you know, as a young woman on the cusp of puberty. We see this in The Exorcist. We see it with Sabrina.
Yeah.
We see it in Charmed, which is, you know, comes from The Craft. We see it in The Craft. The Craft, which was another extremely influential film because all these teenage girls suddenly saw a way to get some autonomy and control over their lives. Never mind that it doesn't, you know, portray a very good lesson for people.
Right.
We don't see it so much in Harry Potter because the coming of age stuff is handled in a very, very delicate way in those movies because these were very small kids and then they became teenagers. So the idea of portraying them as sexual beings or having their power or their journey tied to adolescent coming of age or sexuality is problematic. So I think they kind of skirted that. They stayed away from that probably just as well. But we see it with and Jacob, I'm going to tell you, I get what you said about the new Sabrina. I watched the beginning of season 1 and was like, what's this? By the time you get to season 3, it is pretty spectacular and really well done. It gets so much better. I'm very sad that it's over. I just watched the 4th season, which drops on December 31st. But season 3 is phenomenally good, and I think you would dig it.
Okay.
You can even probably just dive right into season 3. Don't even 2, but 2 is pretty good. Anyway, so I think what that creator has done with that show, he's bringing in layers of Satanism, bringing in layers of paganism, bringing in layers of mythology, bringing in layers of actual modern witchcraft practice and belief and aesthetics, especially. And it's all completely fantastical. But the information that it draws upon and some of the character sort of situations that are, you know, teenagers are experiencing for the most part are very, very realistic. So when it's sort of married to all this totally fantastical stuff about, you know, people coming and going from hell and, you know, these sisters that are witches that one can just kind of murder the other one and bury her and then she's alive 10 minutes later, just crazy stuff going on. It's so over the top that we accept anything that happens. And I think when you get that out of the way, you can then allow for all the metaphorical aspects of witchcraft and magic to permeate that story. And that's why I think it's one of the best things in terms of having done that. But generally speaking, you know, people tend to take what they want out of witchcraft stories. I remember, I'm a big fan of The Wicker Man, the original one, the 1973. We don't speak of that abominable.
That's right. We don't.
Don't talk about it, but we do enjoy it.
Yeah. So anyway, but I remember back in the day, you know, everyone in my coven and all my group of friends thought The Wicker Man was so great, and it was just a great piece of filmmaking and a great horror film and all of that. And then there'd be all these people like, oh no, the pagans, they're portrayed as, you know, the humans sacrificing, bloodthirsty, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, so what? It's a horror film.
Yeah.
And those guys that wrote it probably had a spliff in one hand and a copy of the Golden Bough in the other. And they were like, oh,
Yeah.
what if we, human sacrifice, that's what used to happen back in the day. So why not? And this, we talked about this
In every religion.
too.
Yeah, and all of that.
The idea that
Every religion.
as modern witches, we cannot enjoy and discuss the fact that the portrayal of witches in cinema does not in any way, in most of the time, relate to what we as witches believe, what we do, what our lives look like. And that we need to admit that the very thing that drew us to witchcraft and paganism in the first place often draws upon these same stereotypes and portrayals and myths and legends.
Exactly.
We love that. We love the evil witch who has power. We love the witch who is tortured and goes through pain only to rise again and like vanquish her, her wrongdoers. We love the young witch coming of age who makes all kinds of crazy mistakes, or like, Willow and Buffy, she gets, a little too like power hungry and things fall apart, or Nancy in The Craft, and then she ends up in an insane asylum. All these things, as outrageous as they may be, and even if the portrayals are sort of negative, it's all part of this tapestry of what witchcraft is in the modern imagination. And in order to discuss it, we have to embrace all of it. You have to embrace all of it. You can't just say, I only like movies where witches are good. Well, then you're going to be watching the damn Hallmark Channel for the rest of your life. And I feel sorry for you.
Correct.
That's what it is.
Correct.
I remember coming across a story that the creator of Charmed actually created it 20 years before he actually filmed it.
No,
and at the time,
Charmed is based on The Craft.
Yeah.
So,
sorry?
I'm going to say it's not true because Charmed is really, for the most part, based on The Craft.
Yeah, the original, the Sharon Doherty series. When Charmed was first created, apparently it was something like 10, 20 years before they started filming, and the showrunner, the show creator, said, television's not ready for this yet, and he shelved it. 20 years later, the time becomes right, and suddenly Charmed comes out there, and you have a portrayal of three sisters.
Well, maybe because The Craft was such a big hit, and suddenly everybody wanted teenage witchcraft stories. That's why that show then became like one of the longest running series in history, like 10 years.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But again, its portrayal was quite a nice way of showing that these were three girls getting on with their lives. It wasn't necessarily about, yes, it was about the magic and it was about the witchcraft, but that sometimes took center stage in some of the stories. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was more about the relationships, the love lives, the problems at work, the problems as a family, tied in with what was going on in the extrasensory and in the magical sense, the spiritual sense.
Yeah. Well, I like that you use the word tapestry, Peg, because that's really why I think Thorn Trees is important, and not just Thorn Trees, but any other writing that's coming along, is because the tapestry has tended to be loaded toward a preponderance of stories that are horror. I'm not a big horror fan. You're obviously a horror fan, but
horror fan.
I am not a big horror fan at all. And so therefore it's hard for someone like me who's not a big horror fan to enjoy entertainment about witches, because so much of it is horror. That's not helpful to me. So much of it is fantasy and horror. So that the Hallmark Channel, what's it called, Good Witch, was very attractive to me, because that was more like, oh, that's like Bernadette, like how she lives. Like there's no like demons coming out of she's not sword fighting, these things. And
how do you know?
It's hard to know. And what I like was how, like, my understanding of Magick, there's a lot of understandings about Magick. I mean, there's something that, all right, a friend of mine once talked about how when she came home from work, her husband said he really wanted a beer really badly, and he looked all throughout the refrigerator and he couldn't find a beer. And then she just said something to him like, well, honey, you're gonna have a beer. And he said, oh, are you gonna go to the store? She said, no. So she opens up the refrigerator door, and lo and behold, she finds a beer in the refrigerator. after he's looked and looked and looked. To me, that's like magic. You know, I want him to have a beer. I'm like, there's going to be a beer, and then there's a beer. And this is a true story. I mean, things like that happen a lot.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's what I like about Thorn Trees, and that's what I like about Good Witch. It's like Jacob says, magic is subtle. It's like, you know, for instance, I believe in angels. So I could say right now, oh, Archangel Raphael is here, and you know, he's sitting in the chair over there, and oh, my back is hurting, you know, really bad, and like, oh, because I believe in this connection to this archangel that represents healing, and I just like focus in on connecting to this archangel, the image or a sound, whatever it is, and then suddenly that pain is gone. To me, that's like magic.
It is magic.
That is magic.
So
Yeah, that
it's
is
like, you
purely
know,
magic.
when someone talks about that or those kinds of experiences in the context of, say, a series or a movie, and we get to experience that, but we don't see, like Jacob says, you know, CGI stuff necessarily.
Right.
Unless the CGI is meant to represent what you see or what you hear or what you feel, because that happens too. Like the heartbeat of the tree. Maybe the tree does, you know, I feel the heartbeat, and maybe in, you know, the scene, we use something to make the tree expand or something, or there's like the color red. And you were talking to you right now, Deidra, because you're production, you know, oriented. So, you know, like,
I'll get to that in a moment. I do have something to say about that. Yeah.
How do you make these things happen? So we're not saying, you know, that you can't play with the art or with CGI, but a little bit, because everybody's perception is different, you know, and some of us see things that other people don't see, and how do you represent that? Anyhow, yeah, that's all I wanted to say about the tapestry, and you know, having difficulty being able to watch any content about witchcraft when it's also effing scary.
Well, there is an aspect, and I'm actually going to jump in just a second, Dee, with this, is that there's really no such thing as good versus evil or white versus black. Everything is gray, you know, and we all have that yin yang aspect. So like when people tell me, are you a good witch or are you a white witch? And I'm like, well, the better question is, am I a good person or am I a bad person? And so, and then they say, well, you know, if you're a good witch, you know, you only do this. I go, no. If you want a good job and you pray for a good job, maybe that job is being taken away from someone else. I'm just using that as an example. So, you know, people have this idea about, and backing up what Peg was saying, I love horror, and I love the Addams Family aspects of witches and the craft and all that. It's wonderful because it does show the good and the bad. You know, you look at Morticia Addams, she lives in this castle and she has an incredible amount of love for her family and everything. But on the other hand, she'll take you out too, you know, because that's the human condition and that's who we are. So the Good Witch is great and such, but I also love the Morticia Addams aspect as well and all that other stuff. I studied with Isaac Bonowitz for a long time, and he was a part of the store for a long time, going back to Druidism and stuff like that. And we used to have discussions about white versus dark and light, you know, and white witches and dark witches and all. And he actually studied with LaVey. He actually was a part of that for a long time, the Satanic Church, long ago, like when he was just barely a kid and got out of that real quick. And so I was able to experience that or learn from somebody who actually was a part of that whole thing, as Peg had talked about with Rosemary's Baby. That was a whole LaVey type thing, because he was a real big carny, but we won't get into that.
Well, yeah, Anton LaVey claimed to anyone who would believe him that he played the devil in Rosemary's Baby.
He's such a carny.
It was an actor, but he told everybody, oh yeah, that was me. Yeah,
I believe that.
I think it's hilarious.
I totally believe it. But you know, it's we're all light, we're all dark. It's all about our intentions and how we carry forth with those intentions. So when people say, oh, magic, I said, well, do you pray?
Exactly.
And that's, I'm oversimplifying, but I think you kind of get the gist of it. And I would love to see something, which that's why I'm excited about Thorn Trees, because it does portray it in such a way. You know what I mean? Like, hey, Dee, would you do a spell for me? I'm a little fried. Do you light a candle, or would you put your intentions out for me today, or plant something for me? That's magic.
Yeah, we talk
know
about,
what I mean? It could be something as simple as that.
Yeah, we talk about what is magic, and really magic is defined as like manifestation in a way. And like, what does that mean? It's that 0 point between when does darkness become light? When does nothingness become life? What is that 0 point that our human minds could never truly conceive, because we could always like mathematically, add a zero, like 0.01, 0.001, 0.0. We could always make that moment smaller, but that pinpoint moment of transition is true magic. And if magic is energy and energy is thought, whatever we put our energy into, whether it be, hey, Ma, let me give you some energy today because you're not feeling so great, or man, I really want this job, or let me pray to whomever deity, like what does the label really matter so much as what the message is and what we're doing? In the same way that magic, like as magicians, as witches, as healers, whatever we want to call ourselves, I mean, what is our job? What do we do? I agree with Bernadette. There's no black or white. It's what we do with it. If it's the same argument as like, okay, two people go to school to become a doctor. They both study the same exact things. One takes an oath not to do anything to hurt you. A doctor could easily hurt you, but he won't, or she won't, because they are taking a vow to not, but they have to know what's going to hurt you in order to fix you. That other guy might just be a crazy person, but he learns the same information. It depends on what you do with what your resources are and what your information is. One of the things that I find, going back to kind of what Valerie was saying, the films that I've worked on as a historical magic consultant, like you give the advice on like, this is how it really would be, but the director or whomever will take the dramatic license to make it fun. Like you said, like, do you make a little pulse in the tree? Do you make like a subtle sound of the heartbeat of the tree? What do you do in that regard? And I feel like that's part of magic too, because we're using so many more senses than sound and visual that we could portray on a film or in a book. Like it's your senses that you're going through it. We have to add something else, because as a witch, if I'm doing magic, you're just going to be sitting here looking at me doing this. And that's not really fun to see. And unless we do something that could bring out that inspiration, that vibe, that atmosphere. And like you were talking about props, like here's an example. Here's a prototype prop that I did on a film that I actually production designed. It's a crystal, but like it looks extra iridescent, and it's just made out of resin and some stuff, but it just makes it look a little extra magical on camera. It's not that crystals don't do that when we see it in our mind's eye, when we're working with it. And that's the difference. So it's how to portray something without making floating rocks when she's like drawing upon her energy, but about making that maybe there's a vibration, maybe there's a pulse in the camera, like visual, like it's something that just portrays what magic is to someone that isn't experiencing it. And I think that's the most important part about storytelling, like you said, Valerie. It's just how do we share our message, because it's not necessarily the language we speak it in. It's for me, it's that universal language, which is not words necessarily. It's feeling, it's image, it's sound, it's music. It's something that gives that evokes that emotion. And that's what art is. And that's what magic is. I think they're one and the same.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's too bad that we don't have the capacity as far as at this point to have like aromatherapy to be able to sense what we're watching. Because like if I'm meditating or something, or I'm doing some kind of ritual, I may not have I may be out of sage, but I will smell sage. And there's none of, you guys know what I'm talking about, or I will smell Palo Santo, or I will, so I wish we had some kind of way. I think they tried it in movie theaters at some point, like they put some kind of
they tried to do it with computers that would do it in a digital, but the only thing is they couldn't actually use real scents. They had to use artificial ones in order to get it to be consistent, and that would negate the whole purpose of aromatherapy, using stuff that was artificial.
Right.
Yeah. I studied aromatherapy. There's a lot of things they're trying to do it. I want to speak a little bit to what Deidra was saying, though. Part of it too also has to do with belief. So I teach screenwriting when I was teaching at Emerson, and you'd have a lot of students would want to write horror or whatever. And one of the things I would say to them is, well, one of the things you have to think about is, what do your characters believe? Because there's a trope in horror that you have someone who's a skeptic, you know, especially when you have a supernatural horror or the occult. There's someone who's a skeptic. Sometimes you have someone who's a scholar that knows all the lore, but they're not a believer themselves. And then they come butt up against the real thing, like in Curse of the Demon or something like that. So it's that, but it's also that a lot of times for me, some of the most interesting portrayals of magic or the supernatural happen in terms of like magic realism. We're questioning what's real, and what we're seeing is a particular character's worldview or a particular character's experience. It may be that that character is in an altered state of mind. It may be that that character is having an experience that comes from the realm of dreams or somewhere else, or they're having a vision. So sometimes when those things are portrayed in a realistic context, I'm thinking of a really great film called The Navigator. It's also called A Medieval Odyssey, and it's about a family back in the Dark Ages. They're suffering from the plague. They're trying to escape the plague, and this young boy time travels into the future because they think the way that they're going to escape the plague is if they hang this thing on a steep. It's this crazy thing, but the way that his experience of the future is portrayed and his belief system is portrayed, it feels very real. Or I just typed in like The Witch. The reason The Witch I think is such an incredible film is that every single thing that happens in it, just about, is completely plausible. And everything that doesn't seem plausible or real is purely a product of imagination, fear, you know, folkloric or legendary sort of belief that is grafted onto what's actually happening. And that's why it works so well, because we see that all of the sort of tropes about witches that are in that film that come from actual literature and actual, you know, courtroom testimony and all that stuff, it all works to expand upon what we ourselves might have thought we thought witches were back in the day or whatever, what we still think they are. The idea that this, again, the coming of age thing is a big thing. Not only are the men in the family threatened by Thomason's burgeoning sexuality, her mother is. And I'm not going to spoil the film for anyone that hasn't seen it, and you all should see it, but that confrontation, that conflict, that is enormous and grievous and beautiful and spectacular, and just this, I think it so often comes down to these ideas of what the witch means to us as human beings. The fact of the matter is that the witches that were killed as witches back in the day, and even not all that long ago, were human beings. They were not supernatural beings. The witches in Salem were not witches. They were Puritans. They didn't even believe this stuff. They were true martyrs in that way. And so, but the idea that still to this day, and perhaps even more so than our extremely superstitious ancestors wanted it to be, we want that magical, ethereal, completely supernatural witch to be a real thing, so much so that we recreate it over and over and over again. And that's why I'm on the internet.
Yeah.
You know, that's why I write
agree
about
with
this
that
stuff. I could
completely.
write up this stuff every day, and I do, because it is just endlessly fascinating and endlessly interesting.
And
I agree with that
one of the
completely.
things I talked, I'm sorry. You were
No,
saying-
no, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that Jacob and I talked about early on about Thorn Trees. Like, I really was all in on the witch on that film until they made the woman in the woods like the bad guy. As soon as they did that, I thought, okay, you screwed it for me. I don't like it anymore. And you just killed it, because everything else was really, oh, was the goat really talking, or was that just their imagination? You know, so like the interaction with the mother and the kid, the baby that disappeared, that was up to our imagination until they brought the witch that was in the woods who seduced the boy and all that. I thought, oh no, not this again. So that's when I sort of like.
But again, it's still about belief. Was it an old woman or was it a beautiful woman? Depending on who was imagining it, it was a different thing.
I gotcha. I have to relook at that film too, because I missed that. But back to talks with Jacob about Thorn Trees. Like, one of the things that and you mentioned about it too, or it's a theme about. All right, so like, I go back to my history as an abused child. Okay, here for a second, and I think about one of my abusers, who was a woman who was schizophrenic. And let's say one of the characters in Thorn Trees, goes through, has traumatic PTSD kind of experience. So not, and so there's some, PTSD is supposedly a mental illness, right? It's sort of a designation of that. So my godmother, she was schizophrenic, and so she did all these horrible things. And one of the things I remember is her saying to me one day that she saw Jesus rising outside the window, like calling her to float out there with them. Mm-hmm. And this is because when I look back and I think about my godmother, I'm sure that she was probably horribly abused, whatever created that mental breakdown, that schizophrenia in her life. These are the kind of things to me that are realistic, and the things that I think we need to portray or want to portray in Thorn Trees, like the mental illness, the spiritual illness, the emotional pain and struggle, like you were mentioning, that's happening between the daughter and the witch and the mother. Like, these are the things that to me are realistic or accurate, and not. I mean, it's possible that these creatures exist and demons and things. I'm not saying that they don't. I don't really know. But to me, the demons are the people. They're the people who are mentally ill. They're the people who are spiritually ill. They're people who are cruel. These are the quote unquote devils and demons as I've experienced them in life. I think you get what I'm saying. So I talked to Jacob about that pretty early on, and we decided, because to me, hell is the experiences that I go through or that I went through. Thank God I'm not going through those things anymore as a child. But, that was the hell. To me, the heaven is being free from those horrible things that happen, and from sick people having power and control, over my life. And that these are the kinds of horrors, if you want to talk about horror, to me, that's horror. Not some otherworldly kind of thing. It's like this world and what's happening here and now. And I would say the same about even what's happening today with all the people who are not having money to pay their rent, who are going to be evicted, who are going, these are the horrors of life. And those are the kinds of things that back in the day that are still true today, that Jacob and I are trying to represent in Thorn Trees. Whether it's happening to Protestants and Catholics and Jews and pagans, witches. But we're focusing on witches because this is a story that hasn't been told the way that we want to tell it. Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, totally. That's beautiful. And I'm in complete agreement. That's the realism of magic. That's the realism of witchcraft. We do what we do to break free of those worldly things that hold us there, and that's why they seem so otherworldly. That's why, like what Peg was saying, we have that trope of the witch being either young and beautiful and coming into sexuality because that's scary, it's taboo to talk about, or the old hag that's like just mean, but she's not mean, she's been through crap, like she's going through stuff and she's trying to help people. And I feel like that's what magic really is. One of my favorite moments in learning was actually Bernadette's husband Tommy, my high priest. We were sitting in my grove and my students were around, and someone was like, well, why are witches green and have warts on their faces, and why are they gross? And Tommy was just like, they probably were. And we were all like, what a catastrophic thing to say. And he was like, no, really think about it. They were the healers of the community. They tested all of their herbs and all their healings on themselves before they dared to give it to someone else. They want to help because they've been through something. Yeah. And I feel like as empathic people in witchcraft and magic, whatever, in any spirituality, because there's magic in every spirituality, in every tradition, we're the people that want to help. And who are we to say what religion is wrong? We're just here to say, does it help you? Does it give you hope? Does it give you moral guidelines? Then that's awesome. And in like what you're saying, Valerie, the story of our personal lives, that's why a lot of us come out of the broom closet, to get out of the dark shadows of what we're oppressed with personally. And the witches become that that archetype of the woman that overcomes and could bust through it because we're powerful. And that's why there's that whole like, oh, well, she can't be with a man because then that's like re-putting on the oppression when there's a duality in everything. But what is it represented and what are we trying to represent in Thorn Trees? And that's part of, I think, the beauty of like representing it realistically as well, because that shows what, you know, we're really doing in life and what we're really trying to do and trying to pass on and to give. And isn't that like really the lineage in a lot of ways? Like, we've overcome this, we've unlocked secrets of the universe or the earth, and like, let's work with it. It's kind of
And yet, interestingly enough, I think that's all really beautiful what you said, and I vibe with it. Did I just say I vibe with it? I'm so sorry. But
I love it.
you know what I mean?
We vibe.
And yet, look how far we have not come.
Exactly.
To what Val was just saying, look at the times we're in. We're in a fucking medieval, pardon my French, a medieval style plague, you know, that's as full of superstition and nonsense as back in the 1300s. We are seeing misogyny and toxic masculinity, which is our new word for that, at an all-time high. We're seeing racism just completely undoing every possible, you know, forward movement it might, you know, that civil rights might have bestowed on our nation. It is absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
And you know, I just want to say, witches and pagans, you know, we thought we were going to be part of this new paradigm. We thought we were going to be the new paradigm of protecting the earth and like worshiping a goddess instead of a god that reflected, you know, the feminine sort of aspect of nature, and you know, about cooperation and not conquering, and about nurturing and not, you know, subduing, and about, you know, growing and not tearing down. All that stuff, we didn't make that happen. I mean, I think there were efforts here and there, and sometimes it's, you know, we see a little glimmer of it, but the fact that the neo-pagan movement and the sort of rise in secularism and turning away from monotheism and all of those things, and the rise in feminism, sorry, my dog again, Maisie, go on. Maisie agrees that it didn't have the impact that it should have. You know, I'm going to stop because my dog is joining the choir here.
Okay.
I agree with that. I feel like there's also a rise in witchcraft now, though, because of that, because of what shifted in our world too. It's become like so much more prevalent in the last few years. I mean, it's been there, of course, but I think the last few years have been extra prominent with all of that. And I don't know about you guys, but I've had a lot of people reach out to me kind of like on private message and be like, are you still teaching? Like, can I take these classes? Like, they want to regain that power within themselves to make those changes, I think, or at least, you know, I mean, we can't make a change like to the world so much as we make our changes in ourselves and then the world changes with us, and like we all grow together. And I feel like that's, I guess, yeah, you put it in a good way. Like, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, it's coming back in that way too, because people are aware. Like, we are so much more aware, and like so much more like, oh, it didn't make a change. Now we have to. Again, I feel like that shift is more prominent.
I agree with that. I agree with all of that, and especially with Peg as well. And one of the thoughts that that I've occasionally kept coming back to. I mean, it partly came out of a conversation I had again with Kristen Anglesey, who said, if you look at the history of Welsh witchcraft, they didn't use the word witch. It's a totally different word. The English started coming over in the 1600s talking about witches, and they're like, what are we on about? I've never heard of that word. It's just what we do at home. The word witch has many connotations, and it's something I'm very conscious of as a writer, that when you say the word witch, everyone now pretty much has an idea in their head, whether it be the young, sexy, glamorous, or it be the older one, or even in some cases we've also had a portrayals of the older, as was very accurately said tonight, the older, wiser, not necessarily evil one. But I mean, you had Angela Lansbury, you know, Bedknobs and Broomstick, saving England from the Nazis. She was the witch, you know, as well as Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter. You know, there's a number of references. But of course, the word witch has always been in popular culture, not just to invoke witchcraft, but also as a very derogatory insult. It's being used against women for centuries, not just the cackling potion brewing hag, usually used to any woman who does not know her place, will not stay quiet.
Right.
Exactly.
Who is not content to be just pretty or demure. If you don't conform to a man's world, if you stand up for yourself, you show an ounce of individuality and reject the life that your betters, usually but not exclusively men, choose for you, then you must be a witch.
And
Yeah.
here's an example.
Because the fact is, girls, the ERA will not solve your personal problems. It will not hand you a happy home life. It won't give you a Sunday kind of love, as the popular song goes, and it certainly will not keep your husband from being jealous or petty or dumping you in your middle age for a new, younger model after you have devoted yourself to keeping his home for 20 or 30 years. Because you simply cannot legislate universal sympathy for the middle-aged woman. Now remember this, before you throw away your youth and your beauty and your virtue to join in this new sisterhood of misery.
You are a traitor to your sex. You're an animal.
Now, you are correct on one count. I do leave my home on occasion, and I travel all over the country, and I meet women from all walks of life. And you, Miss Friedan, are the unhappiest woman I have ever met.
And you are a witch. God, I'd like to burn you at the stake.
Point is, that's something that was just made last year. No, this year. I think it was 2020. FX, Mrs. America. And you were just talking about it, Jacob. It just seemed appropriate that, and this was a real incident that happened during the days of the feminist movement. That was a real recreation of a debate between Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly. Yeah.
Intense.
It's weird that, like, to me, if you were to say at some point one of these women's going to call the other one a witch and tell her she wants to burn her at the stake, I would have thought that it would have been Phyllis Schlafly that said it to Betty Friedan. In terms of how that builds up, it's pretty amazing.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah, because she's considered more liberal and kind of things. Yeah, but it's 90 minutes now. It's 2:31. Burn, God, wow, this went so fast.
This was great conversation and great ideas to be shared between all of us. So I thought that was absolutely wonderful.
Oh, great.
It was really lovely virtually meeting all of you and getting to see your faces and see your faces and see your voices, hear your voices, and actually get to learn who you are. I love that. Thank you for inviting me.
And Peg, I finally got to talk to you, so that was
I was
good.
hoping there was going to be more conversation about the thorn trees. I think that we were supposed to do that later, but maybe we, have to.
Maybe we'll do a part
schedule
2.
another Zoom meeting. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm not going anywhere.
That sounds great.
Not going anywhere either.
It was really great to meet all of you, and hope that we can talk again.